What's going on, team? Thank you so much for tuning in. This is Jony Cinco, always here. Thank you so much for tuning in. And again, this is another podcast. And this podcast, its name is The Professional, right? It goes to the professional to get after it, to do what it is to become a master. And it's always important as we get better at our craft. We look ourselves as masters. And at some point, during our time, as we get better, um, as we look back, we find ourselves understanding that there was somebody somewhere that believed in us and took the time to train us. And by doing that, it kind of created that want to know more, to train more. And so, what I ask of you always is just to keep that in mind as we are in this road of mastery. And that was the podcast about. It's just on the road. Um, and one thing I wanted to share with you guys, there's a couple literature that I read, a couple books that I've been reading for a while now. That I always go back to, kind of the faithful books. One of them is the Wisdom of Bullfrog. I always shared it. I shared it a couple of times with a couple of brothers of mine that I went to Warrant Officer candidate school with. Basic course with, and yeah, basic course. So I want to share with you. And this is the book here. Let me see here. So this is the book. It's called the Wisdom of the Bullfrog, right? And there's a couple good anecdotes in this book. Um, there's a couple ones that I like. The stories, very short stories. But one thing I would like to, before I start, give Admiral William H. McCraven. He's a U.S. Navy retired. He was a Navy SEAL, and at one point, I don't know if you know about the history of the Navy SEALs, but at some point, if you're one of the oldest or eldest Navy SEALs, I guess they give you the title of a bullfrog. And that's kind of like why it's called the wisdom of the bullfrog. And in one of the chapters, towards the end, let me see if I can find it. I didn't even book tag it or anything like that, but let's see here. I did read it before. Um, but as I look for it in this one of these chapters, I remember um, it was about him building a frog float, right? And this is during possibly one of the wars that were happening at the time, and he thought as a young infant that he was going to be tasked to become a go to war, and because I'm a product of that. When I joined the military. Well, let me get back to that. So he thought he was going to war. So then, no, he was actually tasked to. He was actually tasked to build a frog float. And he went to the chief. One of the chief petty officers, I guess. Like a E7 or master sergeant. I mean, probably I get a little bit better educated on what the military or the Navy ranks are. But he was in that, and that chief told him, you better better build the best frog boat you would ever build before. The best frog boat or float. I mean, and he did, and then they ended up putting it on the wall, right? Because usually, in history or in any of these military, places you go to, you find that that these places have like plaques, right? Have plaques, have like first places, have history, have banners, have all these different histories when you go into these military places, and you see them on the wall, and some of them, are very historic, so again, he was expecting something like that where he would be kind of like on a wall or something, and not the case, right? So, but he ended up actually doing it, and ended up being pretty cool. Let's see here. And one of the things, also as I kind of look for the pager, I found myself, I found it, but I found myself, reflecting on specific callings, right? Podcasts, audios, sometimes from the Bible. And I relate a lot to the story of David, right? The story of David, and because I'm probably the least a person that should have done something with their life, right? And I say that because I grew up in a pretty bad neighborhood. Well, not even a bad neighborhood. Was influenced by a lot of bad things, and I fell into the trap like many kids, many teenagers, many adolescents. Because there was probably not a clear path of like how do you get to anything, right? And as an adolescent, I didn't see like how some of these things that I was doing affected me or affected my future. So I was bad at school. There was times I did good. My father was a real spiritual man. I would go to church. I would try to be. I was a there was times where I was battling, right? There was a battle between good and evil in me, and there was times where good would win and there's times where bad would win, right? And I would do like both. But almost in a way I'm thankful that that's how I grew up, because it kind of opened my eyes to both. And I understood, possibly at a young age, that all this was that forgiveness, right? That you can that, and that's something that I think the Catholic Church, and as I was going to church and I was being altar boy and serving the church during Mass, kind of taught me that, right, as I was showing my respects, and then doing my first communion. I was always kind of looking for some spiritual guidance throughout the path. So as during my times of falling, after I was falling, and doing bad things, there was always those moments in time where like I would start praying, start praying to God, asking God, like, forgive me for my sins, forgive me for what I've done today. And maybe in those callings and those what's it called, prayers, he listened, right? He listened, and he's always listening, right? And he's the one that kind of grabbed me out of that gutter, right? And that's the only person really, or energy, that could have done that. So I always relate to the story of David, where when Saul came to when to the dad of David, and Samuel, I mean, came to the father, the father, and then asked him for his sons, and he showed all the sons minus David. David was still out there tending the sheep, and no, as he looked at all of them, he realized, like, none of these are the ones that God has sent me to look for. And then when he finally said, my son, I have another son that's out there, and he said, bring him. And when he brought him, he saw him and he knew, he was not the most, handsome, not the most strongest looking guy, not the most, because that's what they expected, right? Saul was that, right? Saul was the king. Saul was the man, and when they brought him, he knew, right? And I can probably foresee him, or as you read the literature, it doesn't express any of the expressions, but you kind of understand, like, why did he choose him, right? Why did he choose David? And sometimes we don't understand how God works, but God kind of finds that person that wasn't the most handsome, the most strongest, the most that had everything going for them, but it's that person that he chooses um, to show his message, right? To give his message, that that anybody, right? Anybody in life, no matter how how you are or bottom you are, you carry some type of message. Um, and I always relate to that because I was always the person that wasn't the best, right? I was never the person that was the outgoing one. I wasn't the one that had the money and things like that. I was the one from divorced parents. I was the one that just had to struggle a little bit more. Going through many struggles. Drug addiction, alcohol. All these different things. Where again, I talked about the good and evil, right? And then at the end, you find yourself wanting these answers, right? Like, why am I going through all this, right? Why am I looking for the easier path? And realize that in any of these paths that God kind of sends for us, they're not going to be easy. They're always going to be hard. They're always going to be struggles. They're always going to be things that we're going to kind of have to fight against. But I think that's the value of life, right? The value of life is going through all these struggles and then knowing that once you get there, it took you that hard work, right? It took those struggles to get there. And I think that's really what the message is, right? When you come about being a professional in the road of mastery, and it's always a road, right? It's always a path. Usually, we kind of see on these pages where the person is already successful, right? And everybody's like, man, that person's already here. And there's very few that follow a person as they progress, right? As they kind of go through the steps of how they are. And the only people that kind of understand, your process is the people that were with you, right? Or knew or were part of your success, right? Whatever, how big or how small that was. For example, like, the other day, by accident, I ended up changing my Facebook profile, my actual like personal one. And, it was already there, but I haven't posted in so long because again, right, I'm grinding, I'm trying to get after it. I'm kind of focusing myself, kind of meditating, kind of reflecting on life and things that I want to do and the things that I always wanted to pursue. But mentally, I always found myself just blocking myself from these things. So, yeah. So then, I posted it and it just a lot of people started commenting, right? Some of the guys that I worked with before, in finance when I was in the military. Well, I'm still in the military, but like back then when I was a finance soldier, Davis, shout out to Davis. But one of them that kind of impacted me for some reason, right? But he's a very great leader. I think he's one of the guys, the reason why, I probably became a warrant officer and just that team, right? That team that I had when I was a young specialist. Shout out to Chief, to Mr. Alexander, Sergeant First Class Alexander, retired, and then Sergeant First Class Soto, and then even Sergeant First Class Flowers. All three of those guys were kind of like that main. All three had a different perspective of how to be a leader. But all of them were a leader at some point for me. And in that one deployment, 15 months, right, of in Iraq, kind of reminds me of that. And when I talk about Sergeant First Class Alexander, he wrote something on there. I think I don't remember the exact words, but kind of like, coming from nothing to something, right? Like building something, and in reality is, leaders can see something in someone greater than what they've seen, right? And that comes with experience, right? That comes with like he might have it, right? That guy might have it. That person might have something that we just don't know what that is, but he has something, right? And he could be a future, whatever. So again, some of these guys would have that gift, right? That gift, that vision of gift of knowing that, that person can be something greater than he believes to himself, and maybe that's what he believed in me. When I read that, he might have even thought about that, but that's how I took it, right? That's how I kind of remember those type of things where like those messages, right? Those messages come in all shapes or sizes. Davis was like, he came out handsome, but you know what? He's always been a good dude, always a good guy, always, shout out to Mr. Davis down there in Texas. Even Mr. Alexander, Alexander, he's in Texas, and then I think Sergeant Soto's in or retired Sergeant Soto, he's down there in Florida, and then you got Flowers, he's out there doing I guess he's selling homes. I guess he's one of those guys, and a bunch of guys, man, from that finance team that kind of shaped a lot of what I did today. Like I could probably talk about Montez. Montez was a guy that as well, specialist Montez. He got out the army before we went to Iraq, but I remember like he pretty much put in my head like one day, and I told him once I became a warrant, I go, you don't know, but that simple words that said when we were, I think and I forgot you were bonuses. I think you worked in bonus, or he worked in bonuses. And he told me on the side, like, hey man, if you're gonna make this a career, go be an officer. Man, I didn't even know anything about the Army, man. I'm the first generation that ever joined the Army in the U.S. Army, right? No one really taught me anything, only this, small, Hispanics, and, any leader was kind of like telling me like what to do. And I just took it like, okay, that's what I got to do. That's what I got to do. And so that's what I did. I mean, Sergeant Soto pulled me to the side, kind of gave me some guidance, and they looked out for me. And I'm thankful for that foundation of what that finance was. I'm thankful for like having those enlisted NCOs that were kind of prior to the war, right? That kind of understood the standards and discipline, and then as they transitioned to the war, they were warriors, right? They knew what it was to be in war, knew how to take care of soldiers, knew what it is to do those type of things. So I'm grateful for that experience that I had with these guys. So shout outs to Charlie Det, and then again, our commander at the time was Major. Well, back then Captain Ramsey. I think she retired, Major Ramsey. Shout out to her as well, because again, all that team, and then what they built, is kind of like the success stories that you can see as a leader, where like a lot of us became officers. Like I think Vasquez, I don't know if he retired yet, but Vasquez, I mean, and then he became an officer. I think he's a captain or major by now, probably. Even same thing with Captain or Major Housey, and a couple of us, a lot of the other ones got out right after the war, but that was the team, right? And then one of the guys that was my brother during that deployment was Garcia. May he rest in peace. And one thing, that was my brother during the deployment, man. I took care of him and he took care of me. And this is something that I believe, it's kind of that full circle, right? Of knowing the fact that all these people are the reason why I'm here today with you guys, right? Um, so here, once again, this is what it is about, right? It's a professional, right? How do we get to mastery, right? But it all starts with something, Once I was in finance and that deployment, and I also know, shout out to Rex White as well. He's down there in, I think, in Tennessee, and just a bunch of different of those guys in Charlie Detachment 15 Finance, right? Those guys were awesome. Were stellar performance. And then during that deployment, I met a big mentor. First Sergeant retired Sykes. He was a big mentor of mine as well during that time. Just that deployment itself, and then we got another officer down there in FA. He's a National Guard. I think he's in Indiana, and he's a principal now in his school, and things like that. And you find yourself where just meeting all these different types of people, right? And knowing that all these guys, as you kind of foresee their future, if you see their progress, maybe you're a small part of that, right? You're a small part of that piece. Because sometimes we're that person that they just got to hear, right? So it goes back to that, right? All these different people, even the mentors, and at some point maybe they were like David, right? I was like David, right? Where I was probably the least person that was supposed to do anything with their lives, right? And that's why I say that sometimes that's how it goes, where we find ourselves, with in that perspective. So then, fast forward, what is it? David, goes back to David again, right? And so this is really what I wanted to get to, right? And this was the why, right? Why is it that you are the one, right? Why is the one that you, out of all the litter of people, right? The litter of of these millions of people, you're that person that gets chosen, right? Gets chosen to show what this is, right? What is the capability of whatever you believe in, right? Your higher power, your God, gods. Why is it that you're the person that's being selected? Why is you're the one listening to these words right now? And to be honest with you, I think it's kind of like, I want to say like maybe that destiny portion of it, where it's like, hey, this is the perfect moment in time to either one, um, you know, take those 5 seconds, take those 5 minutes to reset, regroup, because again, we're not perfect. We always have, our successes and failures. So what I tell you is always is keep that open mind. And what I'm going to go into is something that I wanted to read, right? Because one thing that I can say throughout, again, my foundation, and then later on, going into transportation, and then eventually becoming a warrant officer, right? I had the struggles, right? I had the struggles with wanting to be one, not wanting to be one, getting rid of, or not wanting to do it anymore because I kind of gave up on myself. And it takes certain things, right? When these, they talk about bottom, they talk about like these moments where you fall, and then you decide, right? Is this a moment in time where I keep on going, or I just fail, right? I just continue with this failure, and and I decided the opposite, right? I said I had nothing to lose, and sometimes the most feared person is the person that has nothing to lose, right? And maybe everything to lose. But that's the thing, right? When you have everything to lose, it becomes where it's like, okay, I'm gonna go forward. I'm gonna go for it. I'm gonna go for it. I'm gonna go for it. And that's what I did, right? I just went for it. Blindly, maybe not the best way to do things. I probably could have done a lot better ways how I did, but that's me, right? That's the hard headed stuff of me, right? So what I did is I was like, you know what? I'm gonna control my in a way my destiny, and I'm gonna take the hard jobs. I'm gonna take the jobs that no one wants, right? Because how many times us that or the guys that been in the military, or even just regular professions, right? Some guys are just used to just being in that one spot, one job, and they don't want to kind of progress because the work is hard, and they're comfortable, and I get it. In my case, I wanted to progress. I wanted to be a first sergeant. I wanted to wear the diamond. I wanted to make everybody that, like, again, those guys that were my foundation. And even as I kind of went along and met more mentors, met more, you know, I wanted to make them proud. I wanted to make them proud because, again, they took the time to teach me, train me, give me some type of guidance. And I take all that into consideration every time I do something because I feel like I owe it to them, right? Because I'm a part of that and they're part of me in a way, right? Because anybody could do it on their own, but it takes a certain somebody to kind of provide you some type of guidance, and I'm thankful for that. So I want to show my gratitude through what I do. So again, you know, uh, what why did I become a warrant officer, right? And what kind of propelled me to it? And it goes to these words, right? Fast forward, I'm in Korea. I was a sergeant E5, and then I made the promotion, right? And what I didn't know at the time, right? This was 551 ITTC up there in Korea. I was the training room NCO, and there was a soldier. There was a soldier there that when I told them like I'm gonna get out the army, I made the staff sergeant rank, and I told him I get out the army, and the soldier started crying, right? And I'm just thinking to myself like, what are we doing? Like, I just kind of thought it was, I don't know, maybe something that I just didn't understand why she was crying, and what she told me was like, there's very few of us, right? And she was mainly talking about Hispanics, right? And but that's in all cultures. But in her mind, was very, I guess, she was a PFC, I think, and she wasn't in my section, but she was in a platoon. I was at training room again, and then I had a couple of my soldiers and Katusas in there, and they were in there, I guess, in the training room looking for records. And then I told them I was going to get out as soon as I got back from Korea, and they started crying, right? Because again, I think in their mind was like, I was a good leader, right? But I always say like a lot of the leadership I've grabbed or I received was from those early on leaders that I had. And I remember um, I remember her crying, right? And then she said, kind of in those lines of like, there's rarely that we see, Hispanics, get the rank of staff sergeant. And what I didn't know is 80 Mike's and 80 hotels at the time was very hard to get promoted, even 80 Novembers. But to them to see that, I think it kind of impacted me. Where it's like, okay, there's people out there that are rooting for me, right? Or that would probably want what you have, and they're struggling to get it. And here I am trying to, um, not take advantage of that. So So what I did, I kind of took that, made staff sergeant, went, on and, fast forward, right? So here I am, sergeant first class, after a surgery, again. Down, I thought that was it for me. I just got back from deployment, or a rotation to Europe. Just came back from SLC. Got injured, had ankle surgery. Probably at my lowest point. After surgery, I probably got the heaviest I ever was. And then going to NTC Kuwait. Kind of frustrated with myself because I was just upset. I was upset that I wasn't, I didn't do what I wanted to do. Right, I wasn't to my full potential. Um, so I was upset. I was angry. I remember I had to go to a therapist for a little bit, just kind of to understand, like, what my anger was about, and it was just because I wasn't living to what I expected my life, or what I wanted to do. I kind of gave up on those goals, and I don't even remember what this therapist said, or I don't even remember what she said or what she did or anything like that. But what I kind of took it as, like, I just got to get after it, right? And I got nothing to lose. Like, I already got ankle surgery. I'm already a sergeant first class. I'm about 14 years in. I'm already kind of past the time where, I probably could be a warrant officer. So I just kind of gave up on it. But at the same time, I just was like fed up. And then I found a book called, The War of Art. And it was an audio book at the time. And what I remember is I would put it on in my ears, as I fell asleep. And it talked about resistance. It talked about turning pro. It just talked about so many different things. But reality was, I was my worst enemy. Meaning, I was the one blocking myself from being who I wanted to be, or the goals that I had set for myself. So then at one point, I just kind of clicked. It kind of clicked in my head where I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna go do it. And I just started, man. I started cutting weight, eating right, going to this keto diet, working out twice a day. Again, when you're in Kuwait, it kind of lends itself to that. Kind of grinding, focusing on myself, getting healthy, got off the permanent profile, and during the time that I was at the port in Kuwait, I just started, writing the packet. And I remember as I was writing the packet, there was, when you're ready to be a warrant officer is when everybody is telling you around you, like, hey man, why don't you put your packet in? Hey, why don't you put your packet in? And I'm like, nah, man, I'm gonna be enlisted, right? I'm gonna be an NCO. I'm gonna be a first sergeant. And they're like, all right, and I think what impacted me once, it was, shout out to Chief Leo. He's down there, Leon, I mean, he's down there in Europe somewhere. And he showed me his packet, and I remember seeing his SRB, and then and it was impressive, right? He was like, I mean, he was, it was impressive, let's say. He was an impressive NCO. So my thing was like, okay, well, this guy was an impressive NCO, but he never said anything, right? He never, when he would ask me when we would go to Arif John, and I would be with them in the car, and he would just talk to me. And he would be like, hey, yeah, and he would tell me, like, why don't you become a warrant officer? Like, nah, man, I'm going to be a first sergeant, man. He's like, all right, whatever. And shout out to a couple other guys that were down there, they kind of always asked me, like, why don't you be a warrant officer? Um, and even, outside MOS, I had shout out to Chief Quinones, he was a cook. And then also the same thing with, we had a fires guy down there, and he when I told him I want to be a warrant, as I was kind of like contemplating it, they just gave me their packets. Bam, here's your packet. Like, no, but one thing I knew that I wanted, right, in my experience, was that I just didn't want to be like, I don't want to copy anybody, right? I kind of wanted to be my own, and build my own path. And maybe that's probably the wrong answer, right? Maybe there's an easier, softer way to do things. But in my case, I always wanted to kind of branch off and do my own way. So I didn't ask for no mobility officer, because that's what I am, mobility officer, warrant officer. I didn't ask for anybody's packet. I just was like, okay, you kind of saw the packets of people that were not my MOS. And I kind of absorbed that, rewrote it, kind of did my own. And then I remember the first time, right? I'm telling you like this because the reason why is because there's going to be out there some kids that are probably, well, not kids, excuse me, NCOs, leaders that want to be warrant officers, young soldiers. Right now, I mean, there's different requirements now that they can become warrant officers at any time. But either way, these guys were like, well, I kind of wrote down my first packet of it, and I sent it to shots out, man, to Chief Alexandre, my mentor, my brother. One of the greatest mobilities, out there. You probably, run into him, see him every day, and you guys probably would never know that guy's a fucking stellar performer. And I have to cuss because, again, right, I gotta give always the flowers to the people that are out there, grinding for the team. So either way, he kind of, he pretty much destroyed my pack, and I don't remember the words he said, but I kind of took it like, damn, like, okay, I got to get better at this writing situation, right? So then I remember I thought to myself, I always was a black and white type of guy. I always was a structured guy. And so I was like, okay, well, let me go get a book. And I'm just like, all right, I'm just gonna go to clothing and sales again. I'm gonna wait. I'm in a Starbucks, waiting, for the PSA, the vessel to show up. And I go in and I grab a book called um, Surviving Walks. And I always recommend that every time anybody asks me, like, hey, I want to put my warrant packet, and I go, hey, man, go get this book called Surviving Walks. And the reason why I say it is because in that book, it kind of has the illustrations of like how a pack is looked at the board, right? And it's a retired warrant officer that wrote it. And I don't know if it's facts or true or whatever the case may be, right? But that's what I used, and that's kind of what I used for my structure of how to write, right? And that's what I always tell people: go buy that book, and they'll tell you. I mean, the other stuff is about being a pilot and stuff like that. Don't tell you anything about like warrant officer candidate school. Or maybe it does, but I just honed in on that packet portion, right? I just honed in on that packet portion, and then that's what I did. So then, I used it. I rewrote a lot of it. One thing I was taught at a very young age from my NCOs. Again in finance, and even shout out to Sergeant Soto again, because he was the type of guy that always made me read regulation, understand something, and then ask the question. Right, never ask somebody anything if you didn't do the investigation yourself first. So shout out to him. And he taught me that, right? He taught me like to look at the regulation and read it, or go investigate first before you ask anybody any help, because at least they know that you did something, right? So once I did that, I read it. I rebuilt restructured my packet, and focused in and honed in on exactly what my job was, and take out the kind of the, how they call it, like the fat. Like some of the jobs, they didn't have to be in there, right? They didn't have to. Some of these things didn't have to be in there, so I was like, I'm just gonna just take them off completely. So that's what I did, and then eventually, um, I get back from deployment. There was a little power struggle between me and my brother, Chief Alexandre, because again, I was struggling with where, my mentality, my things, in my mind, and not performing the way I wanted to. And there was still kind of a residue of that. But we worked together, right? I'm grateful to see that, at that moment in time, we made a CW3. Seeing that I made Sergeant First Class. So I felt like, we both kind of got promoted from both the moves that we've done. But in a moment in time, as any, I talk about the Book of Mastery, right? And it kind of references that, right? Kind of references that where, you have at some point, as you are a mentee, right? Your mentor, you have to branch out. You have to kind of do your own thing, and that's not anything bad about the mentor, right? It's more of like, now it's time for that person to kind of do its own thing, right? That person to do his own thing, because he's learned what he had to learn from his mentor, and now it's his turn to go and become a master, right? So then my first branch off of that was going to 4th SFAB, even though I was, the brigade SARC there. I met Verde down there. Shout out to Chief Verde, again, one of the other guys that I kind of worked with as we were getting closer to as I was getting selected and going through my process of becoming a warrant officer. But either way, right? So there you go, right? It's kind of like those processes, right, of all these different people, right, that were part of that process, right? And then really what I was trying to get at is this, right? When you're asked that question, always it's like, okay, why do you want to be a warrant officer? Why do you want to be that? Or sometimes, in these goals that we set ourselves for, right? We think once we get there, that's it, right? Once we get to that goal, that's it. Well, sometimes in some of these goals, right? Goals can be like, okay, I want to run, a 5 minute 2 mile or whatever, or 5 minute 1 mile. Sorry, you make it, bam, and then you go like, where from there? Well, let's go 440, 445, right, or whatever. You try to improve on that, right? Well, when it comes to like the career, like anything, right? You kind of make these things where like, okay, again, I made I saw in first class, right? That was kind of one of the goals, right? One of a big goal to be a senior NCO. But then, once you become a senior NCO, excuse me, you gotta continue to progress, or you gotta continue to fight. You gotta continue to, like, just because you got there doesn't mean you stop. You gotta continue going. So that's where I was trying to get at, where like in those moments in time where you gotta continue going. So I found myself in that moment, right, where once you become a warrant officer, some people, I guess that's it, right? Or once they, become a specific rank, that's it, right? That was their goal. But the thing is, you got to perform in that rank. You got to perform in that profession. You got to perform it, right? It goes back to college, right? Where I remember graduating from college. I got my degree. I was up in this, up on stage, right? Probably not the best grades, to graduate from college. But I graduated from college, right? Graduated from college, and then went back to the same job I had before I even went to college, right? And then I went and became a lead supervisor in Reese Foods, right? Wasn't the best lead, right? But at the end of the day, that's what I went to go do to execute what I went to school for, right? And I was a business administration, but some of that was management, right? So that's how I became a manager or a lead in Reese Foods. But you got to go execute those jobs, right? You got to go execute it. And this is where I wanted to get at, right? So again, full circle, the wisdom, right? The wisdom of the bullfrog, right? Again, and in this portion, right? And I always reference this because I think it's very important to kind of see. And he talks about, Colin Powell, right? That was one of the General Colin Powell, right? During, he was asked the question of why, how to become a general, right? So this is kind of like where I want to put the perspective of and where I kind of want to say what that is, right? In his book, it worked for me. Colin Powell tells the story of an old general sitting in the officers' club who is approached by a brand new Army second lieutenant. The general is on his third martini when the young lieutenant gets up the courage to approach the senior officer. The general is very courteous, and after some small talk, the lieutenant finally asks the question he's been dying to ask. How do you make general? The lieutenant inquires. Well, son, the general answered, here's what you do. You work hard. You work like a dog. You never stop studying. You train your troops hard and take care of them. You are loyal to your commander and your soldiers. You do the best you can in every mission, and you love the Army. You are ready to die for the mission and your troops. That's all you have to do. The lieutenant replies, wow, and that's how you make general? Nah, replies the general. That's how you make first lieutenant. Just keep repeating it and let them see what you've got. Right? And that's kind of that chilling, thing, right? Meaning like, oh, that's how you make warrant? No, man. Like, so this is what I ask, for any of those enlisted, NCOs, that are, or even soldiers that are want to become a warrant officers, right? Do the hard work. Do the hard work now. Because when you become a warrant officer, when you step on the other side, I think it's going to be hard for you, right? And when I say that is because you don't know the situation you're going to run into, right? And where you're going to be at, or what position they're going to put you in. So I ask of you always is that before you become a technical expert, you are an expert, but it has nothing to do with what I believe an expert is or what anybody else is, what you believe, right? And you'll find out. You'll find out once you cross the line, once you cross over, and you're put in those positions where you have to, advise a commander to, or a general, or any rank of an officer, and you have to advise them of how to move their troops, how to move their equipment across the pond, and specifically for mobility officers, right? And I think this is where I wanted to get to, right? One is, if you did it very young in your military career, it's going to be a struggle, right? It's going to be a struggle because you don't have the connection, right? You don't have the connection to multiple mobility officers that are already in the field, right? That don't know you, they don't know who you are, right? And then those also that came from other, organizations, like, some of the guys that we have are from the Air Force. And again, it's not saying that it's bad. It's just that you're going to have to learn as you're going, right? And then you have the guys that that got selected because of perfect timing, and I'm not sugarcoating it, right? It's perfect timing. People probably had a complete packet, and we needed warrant officers, and they got selected, and bam, and now they are where they're at, right? And they struggle, and as a cohort, we'll always help each other, right? And but then there's the guys that took the time to get to become it. And this is where I'll say I'm thankful for how my process was. And the reason why I say is because it's very rare, that an NCO and a warrant have a relationship the way that me and Chief Alexandre kind of built. And he trusted me, like in the few moments that we worked together, right? Goes back to even my leaders as when I was in finance, right? All these different people at some point understood that he has something, right? And he's responsible. He's gonna take care of it. He's gonna do the jobs, right? There's gonna be some ups and downs, of course, like anything, right? You don't know everything. But they took the time to train me, and I was always a gratitude, right? So finally, when I was selected, right, when I seen my name, even shout out to Espinosa, Chief Espinosa down there in Fort Hood. He's the first guy to call me. I was in my bed. I think I was feeling sick. I don't remember what it was. Probably pre-COVID or something like that, And I was feeling sick, man. And he gives me a call like, "Hey, congratulations, man! Your name's on the list." And I was like, "What?" I go on. Even when he told me, I didn't believe it. But I looked at the list, and bam, my name was on there, right? And when I saw that, it was a great feeling. But I knew like I wasn't done, right? I was already training, I can tell you, if you look at my personal page and Facebook during that time, and I was rucking every Thursday, running, I was working out, I was doing all this crazy stuff, right? Because again, my goal in that moment in time was like, I can't fail myself, right? I can fail somebody else, but I can't fail myself, because what I was trying to get at the moment in time, the message I had in my mind during that time was like, if I fail, let's say if I go out there and I go to walks and injure myself, and let's say I fail, or I'm in walks and I'm just not good enough, right? I failed some type of an event or whatever the case may be, and excuse me. I even did land nav, like I did a bunch of different things in the cold, right? and in the cold, and like it was like 20-30 degrees doing land nav, things like that, because again, right, I just wanted to know any stone unturned, right? Because again, right, there was Chief Rob, Robert Smith, shout out, man, retired, and even Chief Alexandre. Like I just didn't want to let these guys down, right? Because this is who I am, right? I just don't want to let the people that invested in me down. So I trained, and then I knew what it was to train hurt, train sore, train, because my mind was like, if I go to school, I just want to know, like, I don't know if they're going to smoke me. And then, now I got to go do ACFT, right? Or the day before, they're going to smoke us. And then the next day, hey, let's do an ACFT. So I had to understand in my mind, like, I was capable to go to a dark place, right? Like, how I can just like, block out the pain or the stress of this physical. And I think what also was an advantage of mine was I was in the SFAB, and these guys were stellar performers, man. When you're around, stellar performers, uh, shout out to my team, the special staff that was down there with us, and then the same thing with Sergeant Major McMurdy, and at the time Colonel Dugan, for hiring me and giving me a chance and being able to even progress. I remember, just those people, right? Those leaders, Sergeant Major Hay also from 3-4, because he was the one that kind of let the door in for me to get at the 4th SFAB. But again, right, even his words, Sergeant Major Haight, was like, hey, you're a stellar performer, but you got to do these X things. And I took that. And so fast forward, right, I get selected, and the feeling was like not even complete, right? Sometimes you were like, hey, yep, I got selected, but no, my thing was I still had to go to walks, and then I prepared myself. And before that, I was preparing like a year prior. I was kind of, because again, I just didn't want to leave no stone unturned. So finally, when I go there, I injured my back like the Friday before I went, and then I drove the walks, hoping my back would kind of loosen up, get there, bam, and the good thing about it, and it's kind of like again, the Lord, the God, God has like this perfect timing, right? Which is COVID, and hey, you got 7 days to quarantine. So then those 7 days, all I took was like, man, I just gotta loosen up on my back, and I didn't care about no, to be honest, like this whole freaking what is it, the the what is it, the warrant officer definition. Like I cared, but in my mind I was more worried about my back. Like, man, I gotta get it. So I remember one of those like, hey, you guys can go out there and run and do all these different physical stuff. So I went and ran, right? I did like I ran, but I did like a mini Murph, no weighted vest, of course, but I was like, okay, let me just go ahead and do some push-ups, some air squats, some pull-ups, run a mile. Let's see. And I was hoping, I was hanging from the pull-up bars, because there was like a pull-up bar somewhere in Rucker, and then I was just like hanging, hoping my back would loosen up, and it did. It ended up loosening up, and by the time we kind of went through the whole like, but you know what? I'll save the candidate story for another podcast, because again, the goal of this one is just trying to show you guys, like, never give up on your dreams, right? Never give up on those. So then finally, um, there was an adversity, right? There's always adversity in any type of things, right? And I remember I failed like test 3 by one question, and then a couple of guys. The funny thing about it, again, I'll talk about that probably in another podcast about like how the Canada school kind of went. But either way, I failed test 3, but then I passed it the following one. And then I was nervous about the last test, which is test 4, and I ended up passing that one as well. And then bam, I become a warrant officer, right? And then you got to go to basic course, and that was in Fort Lee, Virginia. Go there, I stir up a couple things in basic course. Shout out to my brother, David Guerrero, and it just that's my brother, man. When we're in basic course, and we was out there, man, getting it. Again, trying to be the best version of ourselves and trying to learn from each other. And what I realized then, when I was in basic course was, there's very great warrant officers there. And, shout out to Chief Anderson, retired, and then, Miss Chief Smith is still down there. And, Chief Edelman, he's retired as well. These are the guys that kind of were there during that time. And there was another chief, and I don't remember who he was. I mean, he was getting retired or retiring. But one thing I loved about the class is, as an advisor, just came back from being an advisor. So that's what I did. I did that in like my entire time in class. As my peers were kind of struggling with certain portions of the class, like I had no factor, no issue of giving them some advice, right? Hey, this is how I did it. This is how we did it when we were in 3-4, right? Because again, I was probably the one that had the most experience with two rotations with an ABCT to Europe and to Kuwait as an NCO, and then some tactical training as I was with the SFAB. But man, we had stellar guys, man. We had some top-notch guys, man. Shout out to Canelo. Shout out to Chief Randall out there in JBLM, Canelo. Shout out to Rory Guns, and just there's this bunch of great dudes, man, a bunch of great guys that were down there in my class that I kind of still, and there's some guys that you don't jive with, and that's all right. I mean, that's the part of life, we don't get along with everybody. But then when I finally, I remember when you choose prior to going to basic course, I you choose all these different locations you want to go to. I want to go to, people want to go to the places I guess they wanted to go. Me, in my case, not gonna lie, I chose all the places that had an armor brigade. I was like, man, I want to go to Riley, I want to go to Hood, I want to go to Stewart. I put Carson in there, and then I put Bliss. I put all where an armor brigade was, right? Because that's my bread and butter, man. That's ABCT. I was in 3-3 and 3-4. I was thinking, man, I gotta go be in an armor brigade. And shouts out to Yandy back then when she was the branch manager. I guess she seen maybe the hunger I had, and instead of giving me an ABCT, she gave me a striker brigade, right? And she gave me 2-2, and as my assignment. And that was before I went to basic course, so. But I didn't know. What was the deal with these guys. But, I was like, all right, I got what I wanted. I wanted to go to BCT. And I was thankful for that. And I even thanked her, like, thank you for selecting me to be in the BCT. Fast forward, basic course, boom, I get there. 8 months later, I'm taking them to Europe. To Korea. And as a young Mob, right, I'm a warrant officer 1. But the difference goes back to what I was saying, right? You gotta get your training. You gotta get all those different things, before you become a warrant. Like if you're waiting for those things to come, once you are a warrant, it's gonna be very hard. So, so what I noticed, or what I kind of seen, was everything was like you've been there before. I seen things were happening as like I've seen before, right? Like I've been on ground in rail, I've been on at the port, I've been, in the ADAG. I know like all these different operations. I know what the staff does, right? I know what the S1 does, the S2, the S3. I know what, like, all these different sections, the fires. I was asking questions before they were happening because I kind of foreseen, because I've been part of that process, right? More so when we went to Kuwait, right, with Chief Alexandre. So when it came my time to do it, it was fairly easy, right? Because I had products. I had products from one of the best armor brigades out there, right? Shout out to General Simmering, because he was Colonel Simmering back then, great commander. And I learned a lot in my time there while he was the commander for 3-4. But all that, and then Colonel Rorman, the 2-2 commander, that kind of at the time during rotation, I talked a little bit more to the XO, Major Piccini at the time, right? Great, awesome officer as well, and just the staff and style, Major Wisman and all those guys down there, kind of accepted a lot of the course of action and presented the course of actions with Major Torres, the S4, all these different people, right? It was like a perfect storm, that, the S1, all these different guys, just, soldiers, the perfect storm for me to show, like, okay, this is what I'm here to do, right? And what I loved about it is that when they asked me, like, when they ask, like, where you come from, what you've done, and I had said what I've done right before, and then I remember them saying, well, you're the most experienced guy, right? And that was the truth, right? You're the guy, me in my case, that's been deployed, done rotation, so you know what it takes. And what helped a lot too was some of these OPSAR majors that were in a couple of the battalions. I think in the Tomahawks 423. It was an OPSAR major there that was a first sergeant when I was in Europe. We're stranded in Romania. That's another story as well. And he remembers me, right? He remembers me, having a meeting with his battalion commander and telling him like, hey, we ain't got no trains today, right? And they're like, man, okay, and we're stuck there 30 days after, the exercise was complete, just waiting on trains. Again, transportation never goes the way you plan it, but again, you adapt as things are happening. And that's kind of like the thing about us, right? Mobility officers, we always got to kind of adapt to the things that are happening in the moment in time. And then, they accepted it, right? And it goes back to what I was saying, right? You could become a warrant officer, but then I think the really time when you understand what it is and you kind of cement yourself as a MOB, and this is again my personal opinion, but again, that's how I always kind of say, do the work before you become it, right? Do the work before you become a warrant officer. Be able to work before you become because again, right, when you show up to that brigade, they don't care that whatever your background was. Some don't care, some do, right? Like in my case, they did. But again, a lot of the people that I worked with talk for me, right? Again, it talks about these ops sergeant majors that when they ask like, hey, who this guy? Because they in my first couple of runs, they would be like, hey, chief, or hey, wait, what's going on? They looked at me, they shook my hand, and they're like, hey, you know that guy? And then like, yeah, I was with them in Europe, and it happened that way, and it happened to be the ops sergeant major wasn't armored, right, with a tank guy. Go And he asked me one time, like, are you low-key an armor guy? Because again, right, I was in 3-3, I was in 3-4, two armor brigades before I became a warrant. So as a striker brigade, has that special dynamic because you have all the mix of all these different units. So again, right, get ready to deploy, come up with a plan. And I remember, kind of showing the plan to, the installation and the ITO or ITD, depending on where you're at. In this case, ITD, and they didn't like my timeline. A couple people higher than me didn't like my timeline, but at the end of the day, like I knew my timeline was feasible, and I presented to my boss, and my boss accepted that COA, and the COA was most aggressive because I remember after that, I think it was Major Wisman, after I presented, he was like, and talking to Major Pacini, like, hey, what COA did he pick? And he picked the COA 2, which was the most strenuous timeline, and then he was like, yeah, I remember that reaction of that. But it was all feasible, right? I hadn't done the math, I've done the capabilities, I've done what it was, and then when but it took preparation, right? It took preparation on this end before we executed in the motor pools, in the locations that we were at before we got to ITD, and we executed, right? And, shout out to the people that supported on the background, right? Because again, nothing's done by one person, right? But again, you're the one that, as a technical expert, always being looked at like, hey, this is your plan, and you present it, and then as it executes, good or bad, that's your plan, right? Fast forward, we're in Pyeongtaek Port in Korea, and I remember being there when that first striker kind of, drove off because it's perfect, again, goes back to the experience of being at the port before, that first striker, drives off and drives into, the port of Pyeongtaek, and, being there, and people probably thought like, man, hey, and I was approached later on like, hey, chief, man, weren't you excited to see, that first striker, come off the boat? And to be honest, I felt like, man, I gotta get this stuff back. I gotta get this stuff back. Like that was the first thing I thought. Like I didn't care like what that was, right? It was like I gotta get the stuff back. And so that was my thing. So after those, whatever strikers showed up, the next port I was at, there was the majority of the equipment, and I was, kind of already building the plan of how to get out of there. And that's what I did, um, and shout out, right? Because guess what? The perfect storm, right? I had Chief Simpson. Shout out to Chief Simpson. CW5 Simpson now, but back then he was a 4. He was an 8th Army. And you had Chief Alexandre, my mentor again, my brother. He was down there in 25th Battalion, the MCB. And then like the perfect storm. Chief Yi down there in division. The reason why I say that, I shout out to all these 3 mobs, right? And then eventually Verde showed up, right? Talks about the guy that I was with in Fort SFAB. He ended up becoming a warrant officer, and he fast forward, he was down there at 19th ESC. And then, he became, and at some point, during that deployment, he became he just stepped in for a while until the next mob came in after Chief Alexandre left. So what I try to say is that this is the perfect storm, right? It was guys that I worked with before, my mentor, a guy that I brought up, or not brought up, but just kind of motivated, I guess, to become a warrant officer. They were all there, right? Kind of the way the kind of guy works, right? So there wasn't a big like struggle of like why is Chief Martinez or Mr. Martinez at that time doing all these crazy stuff. Well, you know what? There was a big trust in me because they knew what I brought to the table. Because again, right, I took the time, right? I had already 15 years in the Army before, I even made the Master Sergeant list before I became, warrant, like all these different things, right? Like I done the work before I became, right? I became it. And So then when I, then the redeployment, executed, and then we got back, right? And something I always remember, right? I don't know if you ever watched the movie Ford versus Ferrari. I think is what it is, and one thing I always like about that movie, and it's toward the end, it's when I forgot the name of the racer, but he was a great racer. He was the one that kind of helped Ford win, Ferrari, and kind of help catapult that. Um, but either way, he didn't get first place. I guess all the four vehicles were supposed to kind of come in and get like a tie, um, right? And so then toward the end of that, he says, to Shelby, he says, you didn't promise me the win, you promised me the ride, right? And that's how I thought about it, right? Like, I wanted to be a warrant officer because I wanted to test again my capabilities. I wanted to test my mastery. Because again, right, at one point I was a mentee, right? I was mentored. I was taught. I was trained to do these things, and they took the time, right? They took the time to train me to do these things, and so um, when I fast forward, right, and now I'm in that seat, being able to do it, kind of reminds me of that, right? Like if Chief Alexandre would have told me, "Hey, man, what do you think?" I go, "Man, you didn't promise me, anything, but you promised me the ride, right?" And that's what it was, right? To me, was you promised me the ride. So to me, being able to not only do it at before I was 1 year in the military, I mean as a warrant officer, and then execute it and come back and be successful, right? And no one, right? No one ever, and everything's nothing ever is perfect, right? There were some road bumps, but very few. Um, and to be honest, right, it's very hard to kind of um, the next person in line to top that, right? Because I made it so easy, made it look so easy, right? What the people don't understand is when you make something look easy is because again, I did the hard work. And something that I kind of remind myself, kind of like Matt Frazier, right? He was one of the guys that I kind of remember. He's a CrossFitter, a 5-time champion. He talked about like just putting in the work when no one was looking, right? Putting in the work when no one was, right? Because I didn't grow up as I talked about being finance. Like I wasn't a young PFC or specialist or whatever the case may be with these with these 88s, right? No one knew me, so they only knew me from being whoever I worked with, as far as that perspective. So then, um, so they promised me the ride, right? And then I get back, and I I just start working, regular missions, like anything in garrison. But at the end of the day, I found myself, thinking again, staff kind of changes out, and then you kind of you got to redo it, right? This thing's repetitive, right? This thing's repetitive. But again, I think one of the moments in time that I am real appreciative of is just the experience that I've had to be here. Again, how do you become a master of something, right? You got to put yourself out there. You gotta take those hard jobs. You gotta do the things that people are not willing to do, right? And in my case, you know, is deploying, right? Going to, again, to Kuwait, going to Europe, going to Korea, right? Three different COCOMs, three different ways of moving. Learned so much, and it's thankful to everybody that took that time, again, to mentor me, to give me those moments of like that I needed to listen to. So again, this is the podcast, right? This is the podcast. It's professional, the road to mastery. And then again, we'll get into those details, and I can get into other things as well, as far as like how did I become the way I was, not only the physical portion of it, but also, kind of the professional portion of it, how I became a warrant officer. And again, the goal here is, to kind of enlighten the young soldiers, right, that are aspiring to be one, aspiring to be a warrant, or, want to be one. But again, man, we're still here. Currently right now, I'm in a different location. I'm in Fort Knox, Kentucky. Still out here, man, still grinding. And then those people, you see, again, right now, one of the advantages of being, through all that experience is the fact that I get to now see the other side, right? See the other side of the warrant officer, right? And one of the things I can probably say that I kind of see is now that I'm in the position that I am, and I'm seeing the younger warrant officer ones, warrant officer twos going through their deployment. I see now like how maybe, Chief Simpson, or again, or Chief Alexandre, or even Chief Verde, or any of those chiefs that I worked around, right? And I either fell under them, or they supported me, as I was leaving theater. They were probably doing things for me that I just didn't know they were doing for me, right? And I do the same for the guys that are here, because one of the biggest things that people don't understand is when you're on ground and you're seeing, the delays, you're seeing all these struggles, you're seeing all those things that you didn't foresee, right? And you're trying to, advise your commander, advise your no team, and trying to figure out like, how do we move forward, right? How do we move forward with these different, projects or things that you're going through in that moment in time? How do you move forward? How do you move forward? Because that's the thing, right? You got to continue to kind of move forward, right? Because that's what it's about, right? Listen, moving forward, moving forward, moving forward. Um, you know, Being able to assist and be like, hey, this is, here, I advise with this, and even then, I do the exact same thing I did before. Here's some three COAs, present it to your commander, because now in this position is no longer about me being a rock star, right? Or me being out there and being the best I can be. Like, nah, man, like I did that already, in 2-2. That it was me as a brigade mob. Now my job and my sole purpose now, right now, in my position that I am now, is how do I make that warrant officer look like a rock star, right? How do I make him or her look like a rock star for his commander, right? Because that's what leaders do, right? A leader is not about himself, right? Because I can dedicate my time to do that, right? I can dedicate my time to be, a performer on my own, but it isn't the case for me. Like I'm more the person that's gonna fight, that's gonna advocate, that's gonna support, that's gonna try to, as much as I can, support that mobility officer to be the best version of themselves, right? And that's a leader, right? So let's go back, right, to any profession, any position that we're in, is how do you make those people under you better, right? And goes back to shout out to, goes back to when I was in 665 MCT, right? One thing that I can probably say during that time, shout out to Chief, well, back then she was Chief Lundy, and that's how I always remember her, or Chief, well, back then, or Chief Cole, Quineta. There were two soldiers, right? Two soldiers that were in 665 MCT when I was there, and then guess what? Now they're warrant officers, right? And there's a lot of those examples, right, of just people that, again, that you were part of in their career, and they remember, and they have respect for you, and your peers, right? And and then you guys, right? That I have under me, or that I support, really. And that's the goal, right? to give back, and that's what this is what it's about, right? One is to prepare those that are coming, right, for their whatever. Again, as you listen to this, you're probably thinking like, man, it's a lot of the army stuff on here, but reality is it pertains to life itself, right? As a leader, as you progress in your profession, you progress in your job, there's going to be, what about taking those tough jobs, right? Get out that comfort zone, take those jobs that no one else wants, right? And then when you're at the top, right, don't think that you made it by yourself, right? There's always somebody there that trained you, that mentored you, that guided you through this path. And then once you got there, right, it's like, okay, now as you're in that position, of training, of learning, of providing something back to that community that supported you, right, the enterprise, how are you doing that? And and that's the goal, right? The goal is to now bring up more leaders, right? But again, right, there's a standard, right? There's a standard, and to me, that standard is very high, right? To me, that standard is very high, and not because I believe, well, I do believe it. I do believe the standard's high because um, I want those warrants that are going to be warrant officers. They're going to be, techs. They're going to be, professionals. They're going to be the best version of themselves. I want them to be the best, right, of themselves. So in life, only you know that. So as those moments in time, and as when I was grinding, when I was like putting in the work, I still do put in the work. The only person that I had to talk to was myself in the mirror, right? Myself in the mirror, and tell myself, like, hey, did you do enough today? Did you do the work? Is there doubt in what you're saying or what you're doing? Because if there's doubt, then that means that you're not putting in the work. So that's where I had to kind of sit back and reflect on those things. So again, um, I'm grateful to be here with you guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. Again, this is Jony Cinco, part of the podcast, and this is again the podcast of the professional, the road to mastery. And then next time, we're gonna get into a couple other books that I've read, throughout it, and then one that I believe to be very important, and that kind of restructured a lot of my thoughts. But again, goes back to what I originally was talking about, right? Sometimes we're selected. We're selected to be something more than we perceive ourselves to be. And whatever that higher power is that you believe, the universe or God or whatever that you believe, in my case is God. Um, and you're that person. I'm that person, right, to carry this, and and it's nothing to do with if I'm the most qualified to do this or not. Technically, I'm just sharing my experience and how I got to where I got to. I always tell people you don't have to follow the same path that I kind of did. You can follow your own path and do it however you want, but um, you know, sometimes those wake up calls. So again, tune in to the other podcast that I have, which is 5 minutes, 5 seconds. Right, again, it's just to get back at it, get back on the grind. Stay motivated. Work out, set your goals, and continue going. Right, don't at any moment in time during the day you can reset, refit, and keep on going. And that's what it's about. It's about just getting back at it. And don't let yourself down, right? That's the only person that really got to let yourself down. There's people out behind you that you don't know that are looking at you, right? They're seeing what you're doing, seeing what you're accomplishing, seeing all the things, even when you're down, right? Because sometimes people see when you're down and you're lowest, and then when they see you come up and you're like, man, like I doubted this person, and but the biggest person you shouldn't doubt is don't doubt yourself. Don't give up on yourself, because again, you just never know when the opportunities come. And again, I was in those opportunities, and in one of those opportunities, I can say like, I was training. I talked about when I was training to be a warrant officer, right? And then during a moment in time, I knew, as the combat advisors, are about to go away. But at the time, there was a new, a new brigade that was, supposed to be, is one of the kind of the selected few to be part of that organization. Um, I knew that I would be the first mobility officer, a warrant advisor, combat advisor. So that was the goal, right? So as I took that training, I was already doing BAM. You know, I had opportunity like right away within 2 to 3 days. Hey, there's a combat advisor course, and I was ready, and had everybody there in place to kind of take over for me. And I went and I did it. Came back, BAM, gave me warrant officer, BAM, and I was the first one, right, with a brown beret to become a, a combat advisor, mobility officer. Um, and it was cool, right? It was good to be part of that, right? Again, these moments you just don't know, right? Same thing, right? The first Striker Brigade to go to Korea, right? The first Armor Brigade when I was an NCO with Chief Alexandre to go and take it to Europe, right? Full MTO, like all these different things, being the first, right? So you kind of create a path for people, right? And when I was in 70th MCT up in Afghanistan, I was the first MCT to kind of be there, right, and kind of establish stuff, right? So I was the first in a lot of different things, and I'm grateful for all those experiences because again, it just made me a better leader and made me understand like how do you go somewhere with nothing and you build it out of, and you build something, right? And that's kind of like my life, right? Like my life, and it goes back to what Sergeant First Class, retired Alexander. Again, my detachment sergeant from finance put that in Facebook, and I don't know if and he put that right, like from something to nothing, something like that, in those words, and that's what it's about, right? It goes back to David, goes back again, right, where the person that you least expected to do something in life becomes that thing, right, and carries a message. So again, all the glory to God, and the reason why I'm here today with you guys. So thank you very much for tuning in again to the next time. This is episode 1 of the professional, the road to mastery. So thank you very much for tuning in. This is Jony Cinco. Peace.